A word of warning, this podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes some strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing. Hello and welcome to a special edition of True Crime News, the podcast. I'm your host, Ana Garcia. Everyone in the world of true crime has a story to tell about a case that they worked on or they lived through. Investigator Mike King took down a polygamous cult sexually abusing children, and he has worked numerous serial killer cases. Mike has taken his years of experience to examine the criminal mind and identify just how these serial predators exploit and manipulate people, yet can seem so normal on the outside. It's all in his new book, Wolves in Sheep's Clothing. Mike, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Anna. It's always such a pleasure to be with you.
Your book is a little unusual as far as, usually we look at one case on the podcast, but your book, which you gave to me when I recently saw you in Los Angeles, thank you very much, really talks about almost like, how could I say, like scientific themes, if you will, and then the cases that fit and the predators that fit. Who did you write this book for?
You know, I really wrote it primarily for the true crime enthusiast out there, the people that we get to do shows for every day and chat with and hear their comments. And I wanted to try to give them something that would help them have a little bit of balance in their true crime viewing, but more importantly, provide them with some tools that might help them reduce their own risk of becoming a victim to some of these predators that roam the streets.
Don't you feel, Mike, based on your experience, in some cases, especially when someone, in a case of domestic violence, for example, when someone is determined to get you, we've seen how they will and not stop until they murder that person. No matter how many interventions by police, no matter changing of locations and names and all the things that one does to protect themselves. And so there's that level of predator. And then there is the opportunistic predator.
Yeah, in fact, I remember being trained by profilers at the FBI who we actually drew this out on a wall one day, and we talked about the difference between low-risk victims and high-risk victims. And if we were to kind of compartmentalize this, maybe we would look at a low-risk victim like maybe a child or a stay-at-home mom who goes to the school on Thursdays and plays the piano for the choir, and she goes to church on Sunday, and every Saturday at 8:30 in the morning she goes to the gym and then stops at the grocery store. But she has a very set life with a smaller circle of influence around her. She's got close friends. She's got people maybe in her church congregation and her immediate neighbors who kind of know who she is. That kind of an individual isn't the one that's going out on to wild parties, usually on Friday nights. But when something happens to them, statistically, after looking at thousands of criminal cases, what happens is we come to learn that those low-risk victims are generally a target of the thing that happens to them. They are focused on and they are targeted. And that's really an important thing, because as we think about the circle of influence around them or who the possible perpetrators might be, we can immediately, by statistics, say, wait a minute, I've got to look at that closer circle. And that's why we look at the husband or, someone like the parent or someone like that. But on the flip side of the scale, when you talk about somebody who's living a high-risk lifestyle, maybe someone like they're involved in narcotic trafficking illegally, or they're in the sex trade industry, what we've learned is that those individuals are generally an opportunistic victim, and the predator who hurts them is unknown to them. Now, the predator might actually know who they are, but they don't know who this predator is. And I often think about someone like Elizabeth Smart in Salt Lake City when she was abducted. She was a low-risk victim, living in her home in a safe, protected place. So our immediate thought is, what about Ed or Lois Smart or immediate family members or others? But what we didn't realize until later was that there was this predator who came to their home under the guise of doing some work, and he fixated on Elizabeth. So while he was really kind of unknown to her, he really knew who she was, and he was focused on them. So with this idea of low risk and high risk victims, what we have to take into account is that there are three things that could really impact whether they're victimized. Number one is the circumstances, the situation, or the environment. And Elizabeth, because of the circumstance of this man coming in and working in their home, made her then a potential target. But let's take you and me, for instance. The other night we met, we were in a pretty rough part of town. Let's say that I went one direction after dinner and you went another direction instead of you driving me back to my hotel. And before you went home, you're driving home, and all of a sudden you realize, I don't have my cell phone with me. And so we see your risk in this pretty rough neighborhood that we were in initially kind of starting to increase, because now you're not only in a rough neighborhood, but now your cell phone's missing. And then all of a sudden your car breaks down. For some reason, it just stops, and you are stuck in the middle of that location where we were, in a very uncomfortable position. And because of circumstances and environment, your risk level starts to shoot up. So no longer would we say, well, Anna has a small circle of friends that she's very close to, but maybe all of a sudden we have to think, wait a minute, the circumstance changes all of this. So when we start thinking about decisions that we're making or crimes that are happening, we can use that simple little kind of conceptual chart to start to theorize who might be responsible for a crime like this. And I found that is almost always dead center on when it comes to identifying who a criminal is.
Interesting. So you're also telling people that I took you to a really sketchy part of town for dinner, is what you're saying. Living life on the edge.
It was
here.
an awesome place, and it was an awesome dinner, but we had to drive through a part of town that was less than desirable, I think.
Absolutely. Well, that is life in Los Angeles. This is how we roll here. There's something that you mention in your book that I found very interesting. You called it the hunter's gaze. What is that?
I think it's when a predator fixates on an individual. And it can happen in a couple of different ways that I think are really kind of interesting. And primarily, it happens in the fantasy stage. And I hope we talk a little bit about domestic violence and intimate relationships as we go along. But that hunter's gaze, if you think about, I often reflect back on interviewing a serial killer in a Montana prison. I was with another profiler, and we were doing a study for the Department of Justice where we were talking to serial predators who had more than 5 victims that they had murdered, but we wanted to focus on elderly victims and why predators were selecting elderly victims. And this particular predator had about 8 victims, if I remember. But during the course of this 2-day interview inside the Montana State Prison, he confessed to a number of other homicides that he committed. And at one point, I think I was sitting back just trying to take all of this in, and he leaned forward and he said, "You're not understanding this, are you?" And I said, "Oh no, I'm with you, but I'm not understanding the choice that you made." And he said, "Well, let me tell you how this worked for me." And then he leaned into this story that is what I call the hunter's gaze, because he said, have you ever watched those National Geographic films where the lions are out on the tundra in Africa and they're just kind of sunning themselves, laying and licking their paws and rolling on their back, but all of a sudden they start to get hungry. And he said, when that hunger starts to build, the lioness will get up and you'll start to see all the muscles in her body start to tighten up. her ears will become a little stiffer and pushed forward a little bit. And she'll have a gaze as she looks across the tundra for an antelope or some other kind of prey that is much different than at any other moment when you're observing her. This, in my opinion, is the hunter's gaze. And he says, then you'll watch that lioness and she'll creep and crawl and strategize and move and change her environment until she's in the perfect position to pounce on that prey and then kill that prey and consume it. And it's not until after she's killed her prey that she'll go back to laying on the sun and licking the blood off of her paws and rolling on her back and looking like this beautiful little kitty cat that you could walk up and tickle. I've never forgotten that, Anna, because he said at the conclusion of that, every time I kill an old lady, this is exactly how I feel.
And I think that's a bunch of bunk. You know why, Mike? Because the thing about the lioness is that is nature, survival, instinct, right? She doesn't do it out of malice, right? Animals kill to eat and to defend. That's pretty much it. Right?
You know, that's interesting that you would say that. And the reason that I chose wolves in sheep's clothing and the Arctic wolf was I actually was listening to a biologist once talk about how the Arctic wolf moves through the landscape, picking out where they're going to hunt. And they always hunt where they're going to be successful. My grandpa taught me when I was a boy, don't fish where there aren't fish. And so the Arctic wolf will always hunt where there's plenty of prey. And the only time they'll change their location or their hunting grounds is when there's less prey available or a predator of greater prowess, including maybe man coming in and building or somebody with a rifle. And that's the only thing that's going to get them to change the place in which they hunt. The reason I chose the wolf, too, is that the Arctic wolf rarely will kill out of sport, although all animals are documented at times killing out of sport. And so when I think of serial predators, I think they're not only at times killing out of sport or committing violent acts out of sport, but sometimes they're really trying to satisfy a hunger inside of them. And it's not always a physical hunger, but a psychological hunger. And so it really is easy for me to always kind of compare the biological responses of an animal and a serial predator. In fact, as you know, I worked for a major global mapping company for many years. And as a result of that study, I met with that biologist a number of times, and we created a strategy to use the same techniques that she used in tracking wolves to track serial predators, to see if we could understand geographically where they would commit their crimes and if there was some kind of a cycle that would fit when they commit their crimes. So on one hand, I got to agree with you. And on the other hand, not all hungers are in the tummy.
No, they're not. They're not. And, you know, I always have trouble with serial killer cases because I believe they have a mental defect. And because of this defect, it is very hard for me to understand. Other crimes are about there's a motive, there's opportunity, there's the preservation of money, a marriage, no matter how warped these reasons may be. But when it comes to the serial killer, I can't figure it out. There's just something absolutely wrong with this individual. So for them to try and explain it in this, really beautiful hunter's gaze kind of thing with a lioness, it's like, yeah, no, you do not get to compare yourself with a regal animal.
You know, that really is interesting because it sparked a memory in my mind. I took a man who was a religious zealot. His name is Dan Lafferty, and he participated in the ritual homicide of his sister-in-law and her 18-month-old baby. It was a horrendous murder that actually, I think about it often this time of year because it occurred on the 24th of July in Utah many years ago. His brother was convicted and was given the death penalty, and he died in prison actually before the death penalty was satisfied. And Dan is serving a life sentence in prison. And I spent literally hundreds of hours interviewing Dan Lafferty. And finally, at one point, I actually started taking him on the state airplane and flying him to other states to train investigators in how to interrogate and understand ritual abuse and ritual homicide cases. And on one particular occasion, I had Dan in Arizona, and a sheriff brought up the exact same point that you brought up about that. And as we sat back and tried to work through this, I said, Sheriff, you've never had a sense of wanting to murder someone just for sport, have you? And he's like, absolutely not. And I said, but we have to keep in mind that predators are in pursuit of legitimate kinds of needs, but they go about it illegitimately. So we all have needs of wanting to be successful at what we do, or to be have belonging and love. And think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We want to be able to accomplish certain things in our lives. The difference between people like you and me, who maybe in the course of going, when we were younger, dating or going through relationships, or even in professional relationships, when we hit points in the relationship where we're not seeing eye to eye, we sit back and we think to ourselves, what am I doing wrong? What can I change in my behavior to be more approachable or to work through this problem with someone? A predator doesn't think that way. They have the same challenge, but a predator says, by golly, I want it and I'm going to take it. And this is how I'm going to go about it. So for me, as I've interviewed predators over my career, what I found more success doing is recognizing that they might have a legitimate need that they're pursuing. They're just going about it illegitimately. And my job is to put them in prison for the rest of their life if I can do it.
I think the best piece of money advice that I ever got was that it's never too small an amount to save. It really isn't. That's why today's podcast is sponsored by Acorns, because Acorns is the financial wellness app that helps you invest for your future, save for tomorrow, and spend smarter today. It makes it easy for you to start doing more with your money, even rounding up. This is really important, rounding up your spare change to invest automatically. You don't need to be a financial expert. Acorns builds a smart, diversified portfolio for you, so your money is working even when you're not thinking about it. I know investing can be confusing at times. There's no one way to do it, and there's no rule book that you must follow. That's one of the reasons I like Acorns. It makes investing simple. Sign up now, and Acorns will boost your new account with a $5 bonus investment. Join the over 14 million all-time customers who have already saved and invested over $25 billion with Acorns. Head to acorns.com/TCN or download the Acorns app to get started. Paid non-client endorsement compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 2 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors, LLC, is an SEC registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/TCN. How do you help people? You have a whole section about victims, and on this program, we really try more often to use the term survivor, especially for those who do, in a way of reclaiming power over a situation and what's happened, and to turn it around. How do you assist the survivor, and in some cases, the victims here? Because hopefully we've evolved where we've stopped with the victim blaming and shaming. you have a right to, if you want to run at 3 o'clock in the morning, you have an absolute right to do it. Is it perhaps more risky? Yes, as we've seen in some cases where we had some runners who insisted that this is when they were going to run, and it was crime of opportunity, and someone grabbed them and killed them. How does your book help those people?
I actually tackle the jogger in Central Park that was brutally assaulted by a group of young men, and that later became a huge legal issue that is, I think, still being argued a little bit. But I think we have to recognize, number one, that being victimized isn't a destination, but it is an event in life. And I'm no psychologist. It took me 35 years of waiting for the child victims of the Zion Society case that we've talked about on your show to come back later and say, here's what our life has been like since this, which is an absolute roller coaster for every one of those 32 children that went through the abuses that they went through. But we have to also be able to call things like it is without victim blaming. And that is exactly what you said, that if you're going to take certain risks, you have to take the consequence that comes with that. That doesn't mean that you deserve to be victimized, and nobody deserves to be victimized. But there are decisions that we can each make each day to either increase our risk or decrease our risk. And I think we might have even talked about this a few days ago, but I think often of walking out of the mall with my wife late one night many years ago. And we're walking out of the mall and it's dark outside. And I'm thinking to myself, I wonder if we ought to grab a burger on the way home or something. And she says, what are you thinking about? And I'm like, nothing. And I said, what are you thinking about? And she says, I'm looking across the parking lot to see if our car is parked under a light or if it's in a dark area. Are there people in between me and my car that I have to walk past? Her mindset was completely different than my mindset. And what it taught me was a really powerful lesson that we can make decisions on the fly of whether it makes good sense to do something, to jog at 3 o'clock in the morning or to walk out into a parking lot with maybe a bunch of rough looking kids standing around your car and it happens to be in a dark part of the parking lot, or other kinds of things where maybe a quick call to mall security to say, can you walk me to my car, could make all the difference. Maybe a little frustrating, but it could make all the difference. And then on the flip side, after 35 years of waiting to really talk to the children from the Zion Society, to realize that recovery is a constant roller coaster for many, and for most, it may last their entire life where they have triggering moments where they go back and they go downward, and other moments where they realize just how much power they have after learning and growing and developing. So what I try to do in the book is just kind of teach this fact that while we don't want to be paranoid, we do want to be prepared.
Situational awareness. You talk about that in the book.
Yeah, and I think situational awareness is exactly that idea. What am I walking into? What is my decision? I talked about how risk levels can change. A few years ago, we had a situation where we had to leave home real quickly in the middle of the night and travel to another location 300 miles away because somebody was in the hospital. It was a good friend of mine, and we didn't think he was going to live long. In the course of that drive, as we went through central Utah, in those days, we hit spots where we had no cell phone coverage. I just thought to myself, even driving then, I wasn't thinking about being victimized, but I was thinking, what if I have a breakdown and I can't call anybody for help? Those kinds of things we need to keep in our mind. Situational awareness is the idea of what are the risks based on the ever-evolving facts around me, and can I mitigate them in one way or another, or do I just accept the risk and say I'm going to move forward and have to deal with consequence if it happens?
Well, I think, always being aware of your surroundings and following your gut, I honestly believe is so important. I talk about your gut a lot on the program, because I think it took me a long time to understand what it is. And the best description that's ever been shared with me is that it's basically, the computer of your brain that works so much faster than you are truly aware of, sizing up a situation faster than you can comprehend and coming up with a reaction. And while you may not be able to figure it out, like it's not spelled out like with a red flashing warning sign, your body gives you a physical reaction. And it's basically, it has taken in the information, processed it, and said, warning, warning, warning. And then we, as evolved humans, we tried to override our gut with logic. It's like, oh, this will be fine. And I made a decision probably more than a decade ago to stop fighting my gut. That I've shared this before, that if I walk into a place and this has happened and all of a sudden I get a feeling and I can't put my finger on what it is, I say, we got to go. We got to go. We got to go. I remember once I was at the outlet mall in Cabazon, and I am kind of towards the door. I'm in one of the stores, and I see a guy who, I swear to you, looks like he's freshly out of prison, and he's got a look in his eye. And I freaked out because he was standing there and he was kind of scanning around, looking at people, trying to see who was going to engage with him. And I was like, we need to get out of here, and we need to get out of here now. Now, is it possible the man was enjoying a day? It's entirely possible, but I've spent enough time in those horrible places to just get a read and a feeling. And I believe we must listen to our guts and stop trying to talk ourselves out of it. And just, what is the harm? What's the harm of saying, I got to get out of here?
Exactly. Amen. Amen. Because I think about how many times have we talked about cases where even in the course of the case, you'd hear the victim testify from the stand, I had a bad feeling, but I stayed anyway.
Exactly.
I mean, it's like over and over again. I knew I shouldn't answer the door. I knew I shouldn't let that person come in my house to use my phone. And some people will say, especially people of faith, that it's a guardian angel or the spirit whispering to their soul to do this. It might just be that innate thing inside of us that says, danger, Will Robinson. And we have to follow that and be comfortable in following that. And, sometimes it is a feeling that comes on over time, like we find when domestic violence in relationships occur. Because initially, during that honeymoon phase, everything seems really good, but then all of a sudden that person starts to evolve into someone who's dangerous. And but then it's much harder to escape because you're committed. You've moved in together, or you have children, or you've told everyone in your family what a great person this is. All of these kinds of things really play into these decisions to run when that voice is saying run. But there's a whole lot at stake if you do run.
Well, people just want to be nice, and they don't want to be perceived as being, weird or flipping out or, anything like that. And if the person, the predator here is picking up, they can manipulate the fact that work on your good side. It's like, you're hurting my feelings. You would really think that of me. And then you're like, oh yeah, we've all been brought up to be nice and polite. And well, it's enough with the nice and the polite if your life is at risk.
And in the book, I actually talk about one particular case in a New York subway where an individual had the presence of mind to immediately assert these are boundaries that you cannot cross, and then go and get help from the ticket taker near the ticket booths. Just that very move early on, when you sense that, can make all the difference. And the challenge that many people have, and we kind of started off with this idea of sometimes you have a predator who is not going to back down regardless of what you do. Oftentimes, that's because there have been over and over again opportunities where they've been able to eventually manipulate. In the past, it's taken me 5 hours to get this person to cave in. If I got to go 5.5, I'll go 5.5, but they'll eventually cave in. Where if from the very beginning there is a line drawn in the sand that says, you will not cross this line with me, then those are usually when relationships are healthier.
Do you think that there is an absolute pattern to victims? I mean, I think there are certainly some in society who are truly on the margins and therefore, sadly, can be victimized more than others. But you talk about routine, which you've talked about a little bit here about, a child who walks to school the same way every day. There's a safe pattern. There are people watching out for that child. But even within that, the child can be abducted, right?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I was on a interview a few nights ago with a private investigator, and he talked about this repetitive nature that we have about all of us. He said, all I got to do is follow a guy home from work 4 or 5 times. And the first time I follow him, and I realize that he's always going to go past the 7-Eleven. If I feel like I'm getting burned or he's starting to wonder if I'm following him, I'll just wait the next day at the 7-Eleven and then pick him up and follow him a little further. And you think about how repetitive we are in our human nature. Most of us, and I would think most of the people, I'd like them to do maybe a self-assessment while we're talking as they're listening to us. Most of them probably shop at the same grocery store every week. They probably go to the same coffee shop every single morning at the same time to get their cup of coffee. They buy fuel at the same place. They are so predictable in what they do. And, we shouldn't have to be fearful, but it doesn't hurt to mix it up a little bit from time to time.
I have a question for you. I said this once on a podcast, and then someone made a comment on YouTube that made me think. And I was saying that if ever I feel that at any time that I'm being followed, which it's just, again, a feeling. It's just about situational awareness, not because anyone would be really following me for any reason, but it's just one of those things that obviously I'll go a different route, or I won't go where I was actually headed, or sometimes I quickly pull over, which forces the other person to pass. And here was the comment, that by doing so, I was putting myself in more danger by stopping. And what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I don't know, because I guess it depends on where you're stopping. Is it such a predatory area that a 30-second stop in the car with your doors locked and the windows up is going to be bad? I just can't imagine that. But what I always heard, and what this private investigator confirmed, who actually has made a career out of following and taking care of stars who are being stalked, he indicated, choose the right. And I thought, that's kind of weird. And he said, yeah, turn right until you're back on the same street that you were on, because anyone following you, you're going to know it, because they're going to have to come around, but then you're right back on path and you're continuing to move. So maybe that's the answer. Choose the right.
I just saw something recently on Instagram, which I have now incorporated into my life. So, traffic here in Los Angeles is insane. It's legendary. And it's always bumper to bumper. We live in traffic. And this video, which was, I believe, an former FBI person, it was very interesting, said whenever he stops in traffic, he never stops on the bumper. You know how we all stop, 5 inches from each other's bumpers. And he says, no, I always stop, maybe not a whole car length, because then everybody behind me starts losing their mind for fear we might miss the light, but just enough to be able, if I had to, turn to the left, turn to the right, get out of that lane. This is my new thing now, Mike.
It is really good wisdom. Actually, it's something that I learned as a young patrol officer, to do that very thing so that you could get out of a situation that you were uncomfortable with quickly. Another thing that I do to this day, I cannot change the habit. It drives my wife crazy, is I always, when I pull up to an intersection or to that stop line where the crosswalk is, if there are not people in the crosswalk, I pull forward just a little bit so I can look down the sidewalk both directions to see what's coming at me. Now, as a patrol officer, I did that because I wanted to know if somebody was carrying a TV out of a house or something like that. But these kinds of little things can make a huge difference in just being defensive in your life without being paranoid.
I know. Sometimes I do. Like when I did pick you up for dinner, and we were talking about safety, and I'm like warning you not to walk in this neighborhood, and you saw my mace was hanging off my keychain.
I'll never forget it. I was going to actually bring up your pink accessory.
Really, really bright. I know it sounds silly, but it's like, you can't miss that thing. So if it's in my hand or I'm like walking like this, you'd have to be a fool. It is engaged in my fingers on the trigger. And that's one of the things I talked about once on a video. It's like, what good is the mace to you if your finger is not on the trigger and it's ready to go?
I used to watch my wife when she would walk out. She would have the key between
Yes.
it like this, and I would never think of doing that. But it was, and now we have fobs where, but a fob could actually be pretty good to help strengthen the fist if you had to punch somebody.
But you still will usually have the door keys. So still put those through your fingers sticking out like blades.
Yeah, or that fob where you can hit the alarm to make that horn start honking or anything to draw attention to what's going on. But yeah, those are, again, we don't want people to be paranoid. Just think ahead. And if we're thinking ahead, maybe we will choose a different way to accomplish the course we were going to take or the decision we were going to make, and say, hey, maybe I can still jog at 2:00 in the morning, but maybe there are 3 women that want to jog with me, or maybe I jog and I carry Mace with me, or we just start thinking about how can I reduce the risk and still accept the responsibility for the choices that I'm making.
But even when you do everything, Mike, you do everything as well as you possibly can, there are circumstances from which that sometimes you just cannot defend yourself.
Absolutely. But at least you've gone down swinging. You've gone down trying. And I think those are so few and far between in comparison to being groomed into a situation where you're then victimized, that there's a big difference between those two. But there is no question. What do you do when you're at the rock festival in Las Vegas and a wacko decides to start shooting a high power rifle? Those things will never be able to minimize or change. But if you decide, hey, I'm going to go to a bar and get smackingly drunk and need someone to drive me home, you've got to accept the responsibility that maybe this isn't a wise decision.
Mm-hmm. Mike, what are some of the things that you see that just really, you cringe when you wish that people would make, a change or adapt something to make them safer? We've talked about some of the things that we do, but I'm sure you see things quite differently.
I don't know that I see things a whole lot differently than you do. I mean, I really boil down to this idea that, number one, we can reduce our level of risk by just thinking through, what am I doing here? What's the risk that's involved? Is there a better way to do it? But most importantly, if you just follow that inner voice that's saying, this really isn't a good idea. Because again, if you're that person that decides to go jogging at 4:00 in the morning, you got to be thinking to yourself, there's a reason I keep trying to justify this. It's because it doesn't feel right to me. This morning, I decided I was going to try riding my bike on a trail that I've never been able to figure out. I can see it on the map, but it is pretty darn treacherous and goes down a really steep incline. I started down that trail. It was about 6:30 this morning, and I'm on my bike. And all of a sudden I thought, you big goofus, what are you doing? This, not only is there not a really great cell coverage here, if you get hurt, there's nobody that's going to be able to find you down in here, maybe get your cell coverage, I don't know. But I had to think to myself, and I turned around. I walked because it was a really steep incline I started down. I walked the bike back up that, got on the main trail, and started heading back. And I thought, I'm going to just go a different direction and take a little longer bike ride this morning. Well, I made it about, I don't know, 8 or 10 blocks, and both tires on my bike went flat. And I'd actually picked up some of those big thorns in my tires. I didn't even know it. But I would have been down in the middle of nowhere, stuck, had I not listened to that voice. Now, it wasn't life-threatening, but it was increasing my risk by doing something. Even if I'd have had somebody else with me, it would have been a safer move. So I just think we need to think about, what's this thing that I want to do, and is there a way I can do it, still accomplish what I want, but do it safely?
Can we talk about children? Because they're a whole different type of victim, potential victim, because of their innocence, because of their lack of situational awareness. I mean, all they should worry about is, birds, balloons, and butterflies. So,
Amen.
What do you want to talk about there about kids?
Well, I think number one, we need to recognize that there are a lot of children that I believe are at risk, but the Family Services Division doesn't have the power or the manpower to go and actually make their lives safer. So maybe we can step up and pay a little closer attention. Yesterday, again, driving down the road with my wife, we met with someone from the university to talk about a little project that we've been helping the university on. And as we're driving back, I saw this little toddler walking across this park all alone. Man, I slammed on the brakes thinking, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. I turned around, and as soon as I turned around, I saw the mother sitting in the shade beneath a tree with her phone. She was watching that kid like a hawk, but my first instinct was there's something wrong. I don't think we should be afraid to do that when it comes to seeing things. We hear grandparents over and again that say, I'm so worried about my grandchild being in a home that is not safe for them, but I don't want to say anything because I don't want to lose contact with my grandchild. Well, you know what? The child's safety is more important than your contact with them. And I know that there's a fine line between, but this is the way I keep contact with them and keep ensuring that they're safe. But how many times have we heard grandparents say, yeah, I didn't realize my son was being that abusive. I saw things that were wrong, or I saw things that didn't seem like they were safe for that child, but I didn't want to cause a problem in the family. Well, sometimes you got to cause a problem in the family. So we shouldn't be afraid to also call family services. And if we get family services called on us, we ought to be transparent enough to say, yeah, look at it and tell me, and be a little bit thankful that somebody was concerned that there was something that caused them to think that that child might be unsafe. I think of a child like Summer Wells. Harmony Montgomery came to my mind there's another child that was forgotten in the process. But I think of Summer, and I think sometimes we want to also try to assign, when something happens to a child, that everything is the boogeyman. And it's not always the boogeyman. Sometimes they get lost. Sometimes something happens in an accident. But we should never be afraid to really challenge whatever the narrative is and say, let's get an answer. And it isn't us investigating it. It's law enforcement and the Division of Family Services and other people who are equipped to do that. So I really struggle because I'm like you, Anna. I worry so much about children that I see at the store with parents that scream at them and smack their leg and tell them to get in the car or other kinds of things. And, I've never been afraid to call law enforcement and say, hey, I just saw the tag on this car, and the father was screaming at that child and saying, "I'm going to beat you," and I just want him to be checked. I want to at least cleanse my soul that I've told somebody, because I don't want to read about that child being hurt somewhere and thinking to myself, "Holy cow, is that the one I saw at the grocery store?" And I'll tell you, there are families that are under such stress that maybe even good parents might make some really poor decisions at the wrong moment in time. I just don't think we should be afraid to report somebody, especially if it's a family member.
Okay, Mike, your turn now. What do you want to talk about in your book? I asked all the questions, that I was fascinated in. But sometimes when you write a book, there are things or points that nobody else is perhaps or doesn't see the way you do. So whatever you want to talk about in your book that you want to make clear.
I one of the reasons why I love to continually come back to your show, Anna, is that we talk about things on a level playing field, where we talk about maybe shortcomings in investigations and strong points in investigations and other kinds of things. And part of the reason that I wrote the book was to help true crime enthusiasts also find balance in their sleuthing. And I often quote Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, who said it's a capital mistake to make decisions before you have facts, because we spend all of our time twisting the facts to fit our theory that we've got, rather than letting the theory be developed by facts. And so part of what I try to do in the book is talk about crime from a common sense standpoint. I really think fantasy is important, because fantasy plays such a huge role in what happens in the criminal world, especially when it comes to things like crimes of violence, crimes of sexual involvement, those kinds of things. And what I want to try to bring out in the book, and hopefully bring out pretty clearly, is that reality is never as cool as fantasy. And we all have fantasy. I mean, it's just a normal part of life, Some people, it might be that they want to be a famous basketball player or a rock star, and they fantasize about that. But predators fantasize about things that are really off the dark end of the spectrum. And they think about it over and over again. And pretty soon the fantasy isn't satisfying enough, so they have to act it out. And when they start acting that out, let's say in the case of a child's sexual abuse, they realize that all of a sudden this fantasy's falling apart because the child's crying and curling up in a ball and asking for their parents and saying, "Please don't do this to me." Well, the predator doesn't stop. They still try to satisfy whatever that ultimate goal is, but they got to go back and figure out, what did I do wrong? And this creates serial predators who then try to fix that fantasy and then go back out when the fantasy and the dreaming is no longer good enough, and act it out again. And so I really put a lot of emphasis in the book about this idea of fantasy and reality, and that if we can look at the crime scene to try to understand what the fantasy is, it might help us better understand what the crime motivation is and what the victim selection process was all about. Because that's another thing that I really hammer on in the book. Too often in law enforcement especially, it's all about the whodunit instead of who's the victim and why did they become a victim. Because as we start to learn who the victim is and why they were selected, we can come up with things that might help us develop strategies to prevent those kinds of things in the future, or help arm individuals with some tools to make better choices. I also talk about a lot of things like the differences in crime scenes and the difference between organized offenders and disorganized offenders. So again, the book is built, I hope cops will read it and cops will gain a lot out of it, but I really hope the true crime enthusiasts will read it. And then the next time they're listening to some YouTuber out there like me that's got an opinion, that they might just sit back and say, wait a minute, I still need a little more information, because we make a lot better decisions based on evidence than we do emotion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mike, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you. The book is called Wolves in Sheep's Clothing, presumably available everywhere, wherever you can get your book, which is usually like one or two places these days.
Yes, Amazon worldwide. If you're in the United States and you want a signed copy, you can just go to profilingevil.com and pick it up there. But yes, thank you.
I got a signed copy.
And really special people get a long signed copy.
Thank you. So, Mike, it's always a pleasure. What is so special about you is you have this really, if you please take this the right way, but a kindness and a softness to you, even though I know that the work and the things you've done and seen have been like the hardest and the worst. And I don't know how you balance exposure to evil and things that are dark and yet manage to hold the light within you. Does that make sense?
Thank you. And it, like many victims, has been a roller coaster of emotion over the course of my career as I tried to figure out. But I remember I had the opportunity to serve and provide some insight to the Harvard School of Psychiatry and the Law for a number of years. And Dr. Harold Birchstand one night sat down with me, and I was at one of those critical moments when I was really struggling with it. And he said, you can't allow the emotion of the event to cloud your professional responsibility. And he said, you can't allow the anger that you might feel or the frustration with an offender to stop you from getting a confession from them that might keep them from ever hurting again. And so you set it up best, the balance. I just found that with ugliness, you fill your bucket with a lot of ugliness, and unless you're filling it with more light than ugly, then the ugly will take over. So I always try to kind of walk away from it and focus on puppy videos once in a while. And I tell people all the time, quit watching true crime so much. Step away for a moment and watch something really cool and uplifting. But don't watch the lioness hunt.
Oh, well, if she's going to feed her babies, it might be very cute, though.
It's different.
It's like babies eating are very cute. Mike, where can people follow you, find you? I know you've got Profiling Evil, which is on YouTube, and also a podcast, but I know you've also got another podcast coming out soon, which I don't know whether you can talk about yet. So what's going on in Mike King's world?
It's just been crazy. I retired last year, and I feel like I'm running faster than I was before. Anything at the @ Profiling Evil will track me down. And yes, I have a brand new podcast called Gardens of Evil that's going to come out in October. I'm really excited about it, and I think people are going to really like that. I'm going to be in Australia next month working on a documentary. And as you know, I just finished up another season in Los Angeles on another special project that I can't mention the name of. But so I'm doing a little galumping here and there and just having a blast. But the best part of my day is when I get to join folks like you on a call like this.
And in your retirement, for those of you who don't know, but many of you do, you're probably sick of me talking about it, you're now making birdhouses, and you made the birdhouse behind me.
Yes, if you look over Anna's left shoulder, there's a little birdhouse, and I don't know how but it's been a blast to go out in the garage and just destroy pieces of wood and come up with stuff. So.
Well, I thank you for it. It's been wonderful having you, and hope to see you back on the regular podcast.
Thank you, Anna.
All right. This has been a special edition of True Crime News, the podcast. I'm your host, Ana Garcia. Crime never stops, and neither do we.